Since 2017 or so, the Beijing government has increased its control over the Uyghurs and other minority groups in Xinjiang by building a series of camps where they've put away at least 1 million people, according to many estimates, but maybe more. We don't know exactly how many, because getting information out of Xinjiang is very difficult, and we'll touch upon that briefly as well during this session. But we know that there is extensive surveillance all over Xinjiang. So even if you're not in the camps, you are being surveyed by the government. Saying anything to someone outside of the area, for example, to foreign journalists, like two of those in the panel here, can be very dangerous. So it's difficult to know exactly what's going on. But with that, I'm going to stop talking for a while, and I'll introduce you to this wonderful panel we have. I'll just mention, I'll tell you who they are first, and then we'll take one by one with a brief, I'll ask them an open question that they'll answer, and then we'll go to a more sort of informal Q&A afterwards. And if you have any questions, please send them, write them down and send them, and we'll try to get to them at a later point in the session. So with us today, we have Vicky Xu. She's at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and used to be a journalist at the New York Times. She published a report earlier this year about forced labor and how the inmates or the people in the internment camps in Xinjiang have been sent out to other parts of China as forced labor for big Western and other companies that have trademarks that you've heard about. We also have with us Megha Rajagopalan at BuzzFeed News. Megha was the first journalist to go to Xinjiang to discover these camps and to tell the world about them. And it was a big shock when that report came. I remember it very, very vividly myself, reading it and being shocked by the information that Megha brought to us. She is now, I believe, in London. After having spent some time in the Middle East. And finally, we have with us Zumretai Arkin. She is Program and Advocacy Manager at the World Uyghur Congress, doing some very important work to let the world know about what's happening in Xinjiang. And just to put this in context, the level of this is without a doubt the biggest mass internment of civilians in the world since the Second World War. So that puts it in kind of a perspective. But I figured, Vicky, we could start with you. This report about forced labor, people being taken from the internment camps and being sent out to China. If you could tell us briefly what was in the report, what you discovered, and how big of an issue this is in China today.
Thank you for the question. So we published a report from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute this year, where we detailed on, massive movements from Xinjiang to other parts of China, especially coastal China, of Uyghur people. They're considered, they're referred to in Chinese state media as poverty-stricken laborer or surplus labor, but really they were just people who were rounded up from villages or sometimes directly transferred from the camps to these factories throughout China. We estimated that from 2017 to 2019, about 80,000 people were transferred out. But this is according to Chinese official documents, and the real number, the true numbers, are mostly likely to be far higher. And these Uyghur people, when they were transferred to these factories, apparently they do not enjoy any freedom of movement. They live in, they live harsh lives under segregated conditions, and they work for garment factories, for electronics factories, and they're not allowed to practice Islam, and they undertake organized Mandarin studies and patriotic education after work hours. And, we named this report Uyghurs for Sale because these Uyghurs are essentially taken away from their homes, and the organizers and the receiving factories, they both receive a sum of money for each Uyghur person transferred under this state organized scheme. And, from these factories, they make things that will eventually end up at, um, these products will eventually end up in the supply chains of big brands like Nike, like Apple, like Amazon, like Google, Microsoft, and BMW, these car companies, and then clothing companies like Muji, Uniqlo. These things we wear every day. And we found 83 brands like that, which was truly shocking. And since then, we have heard from companies who said they have been able to send the Uyghurs back home, but how they are and what conditions they're in, that's not clear. And apparently this year, the Chinese government is planning to even expand this program furthermore. And that raises a lot of questions, especially in terms of COVID and working conditions, which I believe Megan will have a lot more to say about.
But quickly, just as a follow-up, when you exposed this in your report and you named all these companies, I mean, you mentioned a couple of them now, and I mean, these are big companies: Apple, BMW, Gap, Samsung, Sony, Volkswagen, Uniqlo, all of these. When you confronted them with this information and told them that their products were being made partially with forced labor, what did they say?
For example, Nike, we found that Nike has a factory in Qingdao that makes 7 million pairs of Nike shoes every year. And this factory is equipped with barbed wire fences, watchtower. It has its own police station attached to the factory, and workers there enjoy absolutely no rights of freedom of movement. Nike did not respond to our request for information at all. And after the Washington Post and a lot of other media outlets wrote about this, they came back with a statement saying they wanted to rectify the situation. And the fact the Chinese factory has promised them that they will send the workers back home, relying on expert advice. But the question is, the factory that has put these Uyghur people in danger in the first place, how can we trust them to really deal with the situation with, the most care? How can we really trust them that they will, these Uyghur workers will not be further harmed after these revelations? So that was the best response that we got, actually. Companies like Volkswagen didn't respond. And previously, when they were pointed out to have a presence in Xinjiang, their response was that it made economic sense to them to have a presence in Xinjiang. And essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially they didn't see anything wrong there. So largely, I would say, corporates, their responses to this question has largely been disappointing and underwhelming.
Well, thank you very much, Vicky, for that update. Mega, your name was mentioned, and you've been looking at these camps. I mean, you've been there and seen them in person, and you've been following the story ever since. Could you describe what the living conditions are within these camps? Because, and especially if you know anything about what it's been like after the COVID outbreak, what kind of health conditions are the inmates in these camps experiencing? What's the health situation there?
Sure. So I guess I should say first off, so I've been spending the past few months doing a number of interviews with former detainees. And at this point, I've spoken to probably 2 or 3 dozen, something like that. Mostly about conditions in the camps, like this question. Because of the way that it works when journalists talk to detainees, there's essentially a lag. So what will happen is people will get released and then they'll go to another country, often Kazakhstan if they're Kazakh. Some of them end up in Turkey, even Western Europe, a few other places like that. But it takes people time to get through that process of getting, you know, a green card or the right to live somewhere. So they're not usually willing to talk to anyone in the outside world about their experiences for another 6 months to a year. So as a result of that, it's become really hard to answer this question of what is it like in the camps in this era of COVID-19. Obviously in China, that is like a super, super sensitive issue. And you know, when you have a government that is sort of denying the existence of the camps in the first place to greater or lesser degrees, that does not consider them carceral facilities, they're not going to be forthcoming about this issue of overcrowding and disease in the camps. So kind of on a more broader, like a more broad point about kind of the situation with healthcare in the camps, I think one of the things that I found that has really surprised me is that if you look at this kind of like first generation of camps that we were seeing in the 2017, 2018 era, a lot of these camps were sort of built in this feverish process to detain, you know, hundreds of thousands of people very, very quickly. And even in a place like China, where, you know, they're remarkably efficient with construction, you can't build those facilities that quickly. So what we saw were a lot of repurposed middle schools and high schools, old folks homes, hospitals, these like government buildings were being made into camps, and people would just be brought there en masse. Like I talked to people who described arriving at the gates of these facilities, and there would just be hundreds of people there, you know, just terrified, being forced to go through security, being forced to take their clothes off, to put on camp uniforms in these huge rooms, just absolute chaos. And of course, you cannot fit that many people into these facilities. So people describe conditions that were just desperately overcrowded, two to a twin bed, people even sleeping in shifts occasionally because there were so many in these rooms. As far as healthcare, I've interviewed people who said sometimes that there were medical facilities in the campuses of these camps. Some people said that they were taken to public hospitals, but they were driven in buses and they were kept in a sort of segregated area of these public hospitals to get treatment. I think another thing that stuck out to me, and possibly the most disturbing thing, is sort of the treatment of women. And of course, if you're a woman of childbearing age who finds herself in an internment camp, you would have all of the context of knowing about the Communist Party's policies towards childbirth, you know, including the one-child policy and other restrictions that are put on racial minorities and stuff like that. So I've met women who talked about, for instance, receiving injections, men as well, actually, receiving things that sounded to me like birth control. But if you're from a village, for instance, like in Xinjiang, you may not have that much education about what different kinds of birth control really are. And a lot of those women come out just feeling terrified that they've been, you know, sterilized or had their reproductive organs damaged in some way. People who receive injections, you know, it's possible that these things are just vaccines because of the crowded conditions in these camps. But you know, if you're being forcibly interned, how are you going to trust the doctor that's giving you that? So I can only imagine that when the coronavirus hit, all of these problems were exacerbated by a factor of two, especially given how contagious this disease is.
So this is a health crisis as well, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of that's been considered secondary to some of the more urgent problems like forced labor, as Vicky has written about. But I think certainly in any situation where you have, you know, yeah, just like really intense overcrowding, a population of people whose access to healthcare has historically been very limited anyway, and kind of a governance structure that cares very, very little about the welfare of these people, you know, from ranging from everything to applying, you know, reducing their food portions because, you know, maybe because of shortages, but also out of sort of punishment for bad behavior, to things like beatings and torture. You know, I've talked to people who have been to medical facilities, you know, while they were interned. I talked to a woman who was telling me that nobody ever beat her and nobody ever harmed her, but when she got to this medical facility for this separate issue, she would see people just with bruises all over their bodies and just in very visible pain. This is not a system that cares very deeply for the health of these detainees. And I think in a situation like that, when the whole country is really suffering very hard from coronavirus, these are the people that are clearly going to be forgotten amid all that.
Hmm. All right, thanks, Mega, for that. Zumretai, when we hear stories like this, and we hear from what Vicky has written in her report, those are parts of this of the information that we receive outside of Xinjiang about what's going on there. And for you guys at the World Uyghur Congress, the most important part of your job is to bring awareness to these topics to the rest of the world. And that's in competition with a lot of other big stories, especially now during this past 6 months. Could you talk about that process? How are you working in order to bring these stories out to a broader public?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely difficult, especially in times of a global pandemic. I mean, we've had since 2017, with the emergence of these camps, we've had a lot of coverage, international coverage, because the thing about the repression against Uyghurs is that it didn't happen overnight. It was a slow build up of, it was the result of years of repression, discrimination, systematic repression that was deeply rooted in Chinese society. I mean, I grew up there, I was born there, and I know that this discrimination, we had to live daily with that. And so the camps was just the result of that, years of discrimination. So before the camps, we didn't really have much international coverage on the situation. Even on the 2009 uprising in Urumqi, I was there, and we didn't really get any coverage on that. But I think 2017, because it was the camps, it was such a it was a clear reminder of what happened in the past, that we've gotten a lot of coverage, which is the silver lining in this, is that people were finally waking up on the situation of Uyghurs, on the oppression. But at the same time now, so we had reached a kind of a momentum that we were taking advantage of, obviously in international forums, especially at the UN, European parliaments, where we were our voice was finally being heard at some point, at some extent. And but then that kind of, with the global pandemic that started, that kind of shadowed our work and our struggle. And so it was very difficult, and we had to be creative or just work even harder to put this matter on the agenda of policymakers, of governments, of states, of international forums. So, I mean, the way we do this is that we engage, now we do all of our advocacy virtually, and we try to, because the thing is, China tries to occupy all the space, and we're trying to do that to counter the Chinese narrative and say that, this is our version, this is how our affected community lives with the struggle. And we do private advocacy, or we engage with, we keep engaging with the same forums as before, but just online. And we engage with journalists, and especially Vicky's report, it was just incredible, because it was such a good timing for us, for Uyghur communities, Uyghur NGOs working around the world on this issue. Because these reports are super comprehensive, and they're detailed, and also it's coming from another independent source, which kind of gives us good leverage and good, it's a really good tool for advocacy. So we've been using that a lot, and we've gotten a lot of immediate attention on this specific issue of forced labor. And if I can just add also, during this whole pandemic, China was under national lockdown, and we started getting videos from inside of these massive mass transfer of Uyghur workers, and it was videos filmed on TikTok most of the times, and that emerged on Chinese social medias like Weixin, and Uyghurs in diaspora and some other NGOs. We've used open verification, open source verification tools to verify the legitimacy or the the source of these videos, and we saw that these people, thousands of Uyghur youth were being
rounded up in front of different train stations across the Xinjiang region. And we could also see that they were all dressed in tracksuits, blue tracksuits, and all wearing masks. So it was just like these little indicators that indicated that it was happening during a global pandemic, and while the whole Chinese nation was under lockdown. So this kind of shows and also corroborates the previous reporting that Chinese government does not doesn't take into account or doesn't see the importance of protecting Uyghur lives and just the ongoing discrimination against Uyghurs.
Well, I think it's in. Sorry, Vicky. Yes.
Oh, I just have a couple of points. I wanted to echo what Zumrete said. Since we published the report, we have had questions like, how can we stop this? Or when will this stop? When will the persecution of the Uyghur people stop? And my answer, as a Han person, I also grew up in China, as one of the majority Han. My answer to that would be this whole persecution and mistreatment of an entire people and, the attempt to erase an entire culture will not stop until, a lot of Han Chinese people realize and understand, that there is deeply rooted racism and discrimination ingrained in contemporary, Chinese culture. Or Chinese society. Growing up, as a member of the majority ethnicity, we were sort of taught, influenced by state media and propaganda that the Uyghur people were backward or less educated, they're religious, they're superstitious, and they need to be saved from their backwardness. And this sort of narrative means when the state has decided to target this people, Han Chinese factory workers, Han Chinese police officers, Han Chinese factory owners, they don't have any problem to be on board with this whole scheme because, when the state implements a policy, people have political incentives, people have economic incentives to participate. But the extent of the Uyghur crisis means there are a lot of people who are not just complicit, who are not just, incentivized by money or politics. They also actively embrace this very racist narrative and this discriminatory attitude. And that is a big problem that is going to, be at the core of this issue. And that is going to just lead up to more conflicts and more distrust between the two ethnic groups.
What's your impression of that, Mega? Having been based in China, did you find that the Han majority had any degree of sympathy with what the Uyghur population was going through?
No, but it's hard. Like, I agree with everything that Vicky has just pointed out. You can't generalize. It's a huge country, and it would be really silly to generalize about what people think about it. In general, I think there are two factors that matter. I think the first thing is the fact of China's incredibly censored news media, which has made it very difficult for people to gain accurate information about what's going on. So you can, of course, download a VPN and go and read things outside, but most of the press coverage that has been pretty good has been written in non-Chinese languages for various reasons, like mostly good reasons. But that basically means there's two factors for you. You have to have the technical savvy and the money to download a VPN, and you have to be willing to consume news in a language other than your native language. Most people would not fit into that category. And the second issue, as Vicky has pointed out, is this kind of very long history of racism, like encouraged by the state towards racial minorities, particularly Uyghurs. and other people that have been, and Tibetans and other people that have been associated by the Chinese government with threats to social stability. This is propaganda that is pumped out on the news every single day in China, you know, like demonizing people, caricaturing people, you know, and all of that goes along with the kind of racism that you would find in many other countries, you know, people saying things like, you know, pointing to advantages in terms of college acceptance rates, saying that people in Xinjiang have benefited from economic investment. We're not immune to this in the West. Like, I've read articles in places like the Washington Post and Newsweek that make arguments like this. You know, giving a group of people economic development doesn't give you the right to commit human rights abuses, like, obviously. But I think this is something that has sort of perpetuated like that kind of mythology of Uyghurs and other racial minorities in China taking advantage of the government largesse. Like, that mythology has, I think, been really core to the kind of racism against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other racial minorities that I personally have like experienced and like heard about in China.
But be it race or culture, it's I think there's no doubt that there's a great extent of marginalization of the Uyghur culture, and the Chinese government has used a term like a signification of the Uyghur culture and other minorities. And from the Uyghur community, Zumretai, we've heard the expression cultural genocide being used many times over the course of these past few years. I mean, you grew up in Urumqi, and from what I understand, when you were a kid, you could have a community of Han and Uyghur kids playing together, going to the same school. The differences weren't that great. And now, over the course of the past decade or two, there's been much more of this trying to eradicate the Uyghur culture. Could you tell us some more about that? What does that mean in practice to experience what you label as cultural genocide?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, cultural genocide itself is not very much defined in international law, but the Uyghur community often refers to this term as, because if we look at what's happening right now, you know, like our entire cultural identity is being eradicated and being erased by the Chinese Communist Party. If you just look at the internment camps inside, I myself interviewed some of the detainees, and they were telling us that in these camps, when they're detained, they're not allowed to, you know, even speak their mother tongue, Uyghur language. They're not even allowed to pray or show any religious, you know, practices or anything. They were not all these things, and they're not even able to talk between each other in Uyghur language, and also talk about their culture. And also, if you look at the recent years, a lot of Uyghur scholars and prominent figures in Uyghur culture were being detained. I mean, China's narrative, or a version of it, is, I mean, they changed narratives many times, initially denying the existence of the camps when it first emerged. But then they said it was vocational training centers, or they were teaching Uyghurs professional skills, or they were teaching Mandarin to Uyghurs. But if you look at all these scholars who disappeared, they don't need to be taught these, you know, skills. They're already scholars, they're academics. I mean, I know one of my mom's best friends, she was a doctor. She disappeared since 2018. We don't know where she is. I mean, if she is being re-educated, she doesn't need to be re-educated. She was a doctor. I mean, you know, so if you look at that, thousands of academics were disappeared started disappearing since 2016 and 17. So that's one thing. And if you just look at outside of the camps in the Xinjiang region, all these, you know, the language bans that are happening, China, you know, banning the Uyghur language as a medium of teaching in schools. In 2018, UN experts, they issued a communication on this ban, on the Hotan prefecture ban on Uyghur language at all education levels. They issued it, and there's also concerns that now this similar ban is being expanded to the entire region. And we have seen reporting emerge that a lot of Uyghur schools, or like very famous Uyghur, all Uyghur school education schools, were being now transitioned into all Chinese. So there's this attack on Uyghur culture, like a really active attack. And also, if you look at the children, they are often, when they're when their parents are both detained, they're taken to state-run orphanages. And in these orphanages facilities, they have to undergo similar political re-education. They have to learn Chinese culture and abandon it. I mean, children, the upbringing of the children is very important, and especially if you want to teach your culture, it's from from this young age. And now the Chinese authorities, they're taking control over that and removing all kinds of cultural pride. And the funny thing is, like you said, I grew up and we had no problem, expressing our culture, and we were really proud of it. And I mean, the thing is, the Chinese population, the Hans, they love our culture. They love it. They see us as, they see our culture as beautiful. They love our food. But the thing is, like, they hate Uyghurs. There's this hate between this, both ethnic groups, and it was a result of many years of government policies. And a famous scholar, Ilham Tohti, who was arrested a couple of years ago, he was trying to do just that, to create a bridge between both ethnic groups, to create a dialogue and understanding. And the result of that was him being detained and sentenced to life prison. I mean, this is how Chinese authorities respond to that. And also, another funny fact is that China often, they kind of view Uyghurs in two different ways. One of it is they will often essentialize and portray to the international community Uyghurs through stereotypes, leading to patronizing and discriminatory characterizations. They will be either portrayed as an exotic novelty through dancing and music, or as terrorists or separatists that are backwards, that need re-education. I mean, since we advocate, for that, for the world to know that it's not the case. And I was at the Human Rights Council during the March session, and China, they often do photo exhibitions about the region and the Uyghurs, specifically inside the UN. And they did a big one this time on ethnic and religious harmony inside Xinjiang. And I mean, I went to see the exhibition, and everyone was, all the Uyghurs were portrayed in like a really colorful traditional dresses, talking with Han, or like dancing, singing music. It's all staged. It's all staged. How do you, if that's really the case, then why is our culture being attacked? So this is a way for their international reputation or image to save this image, because believe it or not, China really do care. They do care about their reputation on the international scene.
You mentioned the argument that comes from the Chinese government about terrorism, and if we look back in the history of this, 2001 I think is a very important year, because after the 9/11 attacks, China was able to get the East-Turkestan independence movement onto the list of international terror groups, and that gave the Chinese government an excuse to make this push towards controlling Xinjiang much easier. And then, of course, in 2009, you briefly mentioned that as well, the Urumqi riots, or the street fights between Hans and Uyghurs in Urumqi, which I guess is a direct there's a direct line from that episode to the camps being set up after 2014 and then 2017. I want to ask Vicky or Mega, or both of you, when you hear that argument about having to control the Uyghur population in order to avoid terrorist camps being built, or fundamentalists being able to roam freely, how do you respond to that? Is that a valid point?
I mean, are there Uyghur terrorists? Yes, there are Uyghur people fighting alongside ISIS in Syria. This is a legitimate concern, and there have been riots and violence in the past conducted by both the Uyghurs and Han people. And it take two parties to have a conflict. So yes, there has been violence, but how do you respond to that? Do you intern 1 million of a population to stop terrorist attacks? No, you do not. You do not see that being done by any reasonable government, and that response is completely out of proportion. And I would say, the Chinese government keeps saying it's opening up these vocational training centers to in the Chinese government's white paper, it says they put this Uyghur people in these centers. They have done something that has terrorist tendencies, but not exactly committed any crimes. So they put them there and educate them to prevent them from committing crimes. So there's this notion of these people have not committed crimes, but something more like a pre-crime. They're about to commit crimes, but they haven't. And then 1 million people get interned for these perceived pre-crimes. So that is, the Chinese government completely redefining its own laws and redefining what constitutes crimes, and subjecting an entire people and cultural practices and equating that to terrorism, which again is out of proportion. And I don't think to anyone that is looking at this issue from an international law, from a human rights point of view, no one can say that terrorism is any longer a reason to justify these detentions.
If I can just quickly add something to Vicky's point, it is completely out of proportion what the Chinese government is doing. I mean, this terrorism threat is a threat for the entire world, and we don't see any country do this similar, massive internment of people. And also, the thing is, with the recent leaks that we had, the China cables, the Qaraqash list that we had, we also saw the problem is the dehumanizing language that comes from high officials and Xi Jinping himself. And he described in these documents, he described Islam as a virus that needs to be eradicated. I mean, you can tell from that how this current crackdown, that's in his point of view, how he or the Chinese authorities see a religion or a culture as a threat to them. And just from the Qaraqash list leak, we also know that being interned, these people who are interned, they can be interned for very, very arbitrary reasons, such as going to pilgrimage, the Islamic pilgrimage, going to the Hajj, having traveled to Islamic countries before, like Turkey, the Gulf countries, Egypt, and having family members abroad. That can also be one reason for detainment. And you also have these like 3 spheres of if someone's relatives is at some point, there was a graphic that kind of showed that if someone's aunt was, used to practice religion really, she used to wear a veil or pray 5 times a day, and then that would have repercussions on her nephews or on her extended family members, and also just these really arbitrary reasons. And I mean, is that a reason for this current? Does that justify the current crackdown on an entire ethnic group? No, it doesn't. It does not.
I was one of the journalists working on the Qaraqash list, and I mean, the number of things you can do in order to get in trouble with the local authorities there. I mean, for viewers who don't know the story, this was a leaked list of inmates and the names of their family members and the reason why they had been put in the internment camps in Karakach, which is in the south of the Xinjiang region. And I mean, growing a beard, that can be a reason for going into the camps. So it's clearly not in adherence with the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. But I mean, that's one sense of arbitrary punishment. I see that time is running away from us. We'll have to move on to some other topics. I figured, since we can regard this and also as sort of an information war, trying to bring the story out there. One of the things that's happening, we've seen, and I guess all three of you are examples of that and can illustrate that, is that the Chinese government is pressuring individuals and groups outside of the borders of the People's Republic of China. And Zumretai, I think we could start with you. I know that in Norway and in, I guess, most other countries where there are big Uyghur exile communities, people are being pressured to keep quiet, or else their families might get in trouble. Could you briefly just tell us more about that, please?
Yes. So this is a very common, strategy used by China to try to silence Uyghurs abroad, because they know how the Uyghur diaspora are, we're very active in denouncing these human rights abuses committed by the Chinese authorities. And so they will often use our family members back home to basically engage in hostage diplomacy that we call. They will often contact, so Chinese officials from inside the region will often reach out to Uyghur, the relatives of these Uyghurs in Xinjiang abroad. So they will often use Weixin, which is WeChat, a Chinese application, and reach out directly to these people and say, can we talk? Or they will call them and try to, say, you should be careful about what you say in public or in these countries. You have to be careful. You have to think about your family members. And we have like screenshots of these conversations with these officials. And this is not only happening inside Europe. This is happening everywhere, in Australia, in Canada, US, everywhere there is a big Uyghur community, that is happening. And we also have direct threats and so on. I mean, my own dad, he's a very vocal activist, and he went back to the region in 2013 after 20 years in Canada. With a Canadian passport, he waited to be a citizen because he knew the risks. He went back to visit his family, and he knew that it was probably going to be his last time. He wanted to see his aging mother, and he went 3 days after he was there. He was interrogated by police, by security officers, and he was interrogated for hours about his motives of coming back, and it was just, and he was even interrogated on what the Uyghur community was doing inside Canada, inside like in Montreal, the Montreal community, and inside the US. And he was asked about Rabia Qadir, who, I mean, and when he refused to answer, they said, well, anyway, we know about all of your activities abroad. And they had a huge file. And he said, I don't have to answer to you. I'm a citizen of Canada. And they said, your citizenship doesn't protect you here. And I mean, his story was covered by many media outlets. And when he came back over that summer, he was interrogated a couple of times. And then when he came back, he had to agree to spy, because the Chinese officials who interrogated him asked him to spy for the Uyghur community if he wanted to leave for Canada. So he had to agree. And then when he came back, we had a call. We were having a family supper, and we had a call from the Chinese officials themselves from China, who called him and said, do you have any updates from what we asked you? And he just said, well, sorry, I've been busy. I don't know anything. And then we reported these incidents to Canadian authorities. And this kind of tactic happens everywhere. Even worse things happen. So the reprisals, the retaliation against the Uyghur community abroad is a very real thing. And China keeps denying that it's not, but we're millions of, we're thousands and up to 1 million Uyghurs abroad. And are we all lying about this? Why would we invent such facts,
Yeah, and it's very difficult. It's proven for local governments to do anything about this. It's difficult to get to respond to it in a coherent way. I mean, Vicky, you've been quite open about the reactions after the report you published this year about threats to you and to your family members who are in China. Could you tell us some more about that?
I have been writing about human rights and the Uyghur situation for a couple of years now, and since my first article was out about the Australian Uyghur community, which it is exactly like Zumrete said. We have these threats, and we have these people are being followed, people are being threatened. People are being pressured into being spies for China. It's exactly as she said. So when I wrote about that, the next thing I know, in a few days, my father would get a call from the police, and they would ask him if I'm his daughter, and they would put pressure on my family, trying to silence me. They have done this again more recently. And, there are, like Mega said, there are Han people who are sympathetic. There are a few of us working on this issue more, there are a number of us working on this issue, trying to build some sort of bridges, or trying to make the world more aware of the issue. But it's so difficult for Han Chinese people to be able to say anything, because even when we're abroad, the Chinese state, Alex Umrate said, does not care about your nationality. As long as you're in their orbit, they consider you in their orbit, they assume ownership of you. So even when I'm in Australia, even when I'm a resident here, and the Chinese authorities have a million ways to reach me, photograph me, follow me, threaten me, and waging these media wars against me. And at this point, I have lost a lot of things. My friends, families have cut ties with me because of what I do. What I write about the Uyghurs is considered traitorous. But I think to do this kind of work, we all pay a price. And we have seen that Mega has essentially, correct me if I'm wrong, but she has had to leave China because of her reporting on Xinjiang. In a way, this unites us. But also, when journalists and individuals and academics have to pay a price for speaking up, for talking about these issues, it doesn't invite more people in. It's very alienating, and at times it's very disheartening.
And Mega, I think you and I share this this trait of being on the blacklist, and you were thrown out after your reporting on the camps. But do you think, is that an effective strategy for the Chinese government? I mean, now over the past couple of months, they've thrown out reporters from several big American newspapers as well. It's getting increasingly difficult to get to Xinjiang to actually discover what's happening there. Is that effective in terms of an information strategy from the government?
I think yes and no. I think it's been well documented that Chinese pressure on like international news organizations has resulted in self-censorship. The most famous example being Bloomberg with their censorship about of reports on the elite wealth in China. But there are many other examples of this. When you're talking about actually reporting on the ground in Xinjiang, it's logistically very difficult. News organizations are obviously really cash strapped, and it's really expensive to fly from Beijing to Urumqi, let alone from somewhere else to there. And then even to take local flights. And on top of that, as soon as you show up, pretty much for all journalists who have a J visa in their passport, you're followed around pretty much the entire time. So essentially what that means is that you can't really do a lot of work that well because somebody is there intimidating your sources, trying to prevent you from doing it. So all of these things are sort of disincentives for news organizations to focus on it. So when you look at last year and even the year before, that didn't matter that much because this was a really big story. I mean, as you said, it's like the biggest mass internment of people since World War II. Of course, it's going to be a huge story. But now we're in a different news cycle where there are all of these other, seismic things that have happened around the world. And I guess it remains to be seen whether news organizations will still commit resources to this story, particularly after the Chinese government has thrown out so many reporters from the top publications in the United States. The sort of silver lining to this is that there is such a big diaspora of Uyghurs and Kazakhs outside the country, and these people are, increasingly courageous in their willingness to tell the stories of what is happening to them and their family members. And you can sort of meet those people and access those people as a journalist without having to visit the PRC. But it's insane. Like we're all sitting here staring at these crazy satellite images of huge internment camps, and I think the thing that stuck with me, since 2017 is just like, how is this possible in this day and age, in this very hyper-connected age, to basically that the fact that none of us really has a good estimate of how many people are in these camps. Or what they look like inside, other than sort of witness accounts and satellite images. Like, how is it possible to just hide 1 million people? I'm still sort of wondering about that question. And I think the government is going to more and more lengths to sort of stifle coverage of it however they can.
But at the same time, Zumretai, there seems to be a shift in global, or at least Western attitudes in terms of how to deal with human rights abuses in China. There was an engagement policy for a long time trying to work from the theory that if we work from the ground up and if we treat the Chinese government with respect and silk gloves, then things might change somehow. But that's changed over the last couple of years, especially. And I guess the US and the current administration have been taking a lead there, helped by Congress, and now with this new Uyghur Human Rights Act in Congress. Does that help? Do you see any concrete signs that this change in policy from at least some Western countries is helping the situation on the ground, or for the Uyghur community in general?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And the thing is, with all this pandemic, or just even the recent human rights abuses committed by China, the world realized that quiet diplomacy does not work with China, is not effective. So I think there was a shift, like you said, in the way they address these situations, especially human rights violations in Tibet, in East-Turkestan, all these places. And the US have, of course, like you said, the US administration has taken the lead on it. Whether, their motivations are, I don't know about their motivations, but at least they are the first country in the world that took a firm stance against the crimes committed by China. So I think that with the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, this kind of really reinvigorated hope and a good news for Uyghur the diaspora, because we are living under, we're living such big traumas. And I mean, like Vicky said, all these threats, I mean, I cut ties with my family because I'm afraid for their safety. And I know that they've started being interrogated by police because of my work, and all these repercussions and consequences. But at least this kind of law gives us hope for the community to think that, a country, such a powerful country like the US is doing something and taking our voice into consideration, and they're listening and they're doing something actively to fight against the Chinese narrative that what they're doing is okay. And we think that with this, with them taking the lead, it will maybe push other countries to do similar things. Maybe not legislations, a similar legislation, but it will maybe improve their stand on China and how they in their bilateral relations with China and how they respond to this crisis, and also to keep the Uyghur issue on their agenda.
Well, thank you. And I think on that note of slight optimism, it's a good place to wrap this this webinar up. This has been very insightful and interesting. So I'd like to thank all three of you, Vicky Xu, Megha Rajagopalan, and Zumretai Arkin. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar today. And thank you to the Rafto Foundation for setting the whole thing up. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.